It's hard to beat the slow-burning satisfaction of a great tactics game. Who needs sweaty PvP lobbies and limited edition cans of Mountain Dew when you can just kick back at your own pace with a cigar and cosplay as 41st century General Custer? After all, after a long day at work, nothing beats relaxing by thinking way harder than you did at any point during the workday. You see, these are the joys of turn-based strategy that are hard to explain to people who don't click with the genre. Enter Chains of Freedom, the latest fresh meat thrown to a niche tactics game audience, of which I am a very hungry member. Chains of Freedom developer Nordcurrent has primarily been a mobile game developer going back to 2010, and a cursory glance at their list of past titles, including 2020's evocatively named Airplane Chefs, doesn't exactly inspire confidence. It's surprising then that within your first couple of hours in Chains of Freedom, you'll be able to see that the studio had a fairly tight and well-defined vision for this title's gameplay loop. The game offers 3 core systems that form that core loop, and those are exploration with survival scavenging, stealth, and combat. Survival mechanics are a little bit eyebrow-raising to be incorporated into a tactics game, but it's not entirely without precedent. Other games like 2023's Miasma Chronicles, and actually even last year's Unicorn Overlord, if you're willing to stretch this a bit, have dabbled in this overworld survival scavenging mechanic as a counterpoint to their combat core, but I give credit to Chains of Freedom for taking a very focused, albeit simplified, approach and version of that here. Exploration goes like this. In between combat encounters, you navigate a linear overworld from an isometric perspective, and you're going to check every nook and cranny for resources that you're going to need in order to craft healing, ammo, grenades, and special items. Now, chief among those needs is ammo. In fact, one of Chains of Freedom's riskiest choices is introducing some fairly severe ammo scarcity into a tactics game, where, the main thing you do is shoot things. We'll get to that more in a sec. Then there's the stealth sections, which are definitely the weakest of the 3 main mechanics. This is a very bare-bones realization of stealth where you'll have to creep through enemy camps unspotted or basically risk being thrust into combat out of position against overwhelming numbers of enemies. These sections give you a few choices. Are you going to sneak through the camp fully, looting all of those urgently needed items littered around, or do you hightail it for the exit with your health intact? Or do you attempt the sneaking at all? Or do you just refuse to engage with the stealth and come in with guns blazing from the outset? Each choice has significant consequences on your campaign, because if you fail to loot enough resources, either in those stealth sections or just in general, you'll be very badly under-equipped for the next fights, and that can lead to what's basically a cascading spiral of scarcity. Now, on the other hand, clearing out every optional enemy encampment also comes with its own downside, because you'll lose health and ammo just fighting those. So choosing to steamroll the stealth sections with combat unfortunately results in kind of a Pyrrhic victory, in that your looting spree after a stealth section fight usually just replaces what you used in that fight itself, and that leaves you at net zero or usually slightly worse off than before you started. It's here where what could have been an interesting player-empowered choice starts to break down, as the calculus I just described only leads to one actual correct or net positive way to handle the stealth sections, and that is to painstakingly loot the camp undetected and avoid fighting. The problem here is that the game is, just not very good at stealth, making it just way too easy for you to be spotted, ultimately alerting the dozens of super shotgun-wielding enemies in the camp all at once. Even worse, your characters are forced into a slow crouch walk during these stealth set pieces, and there is no way to quickly sprint for cover if you're close to being caught. just a clunky experience that frustrates and slows the game down. Although fortunately you are allowed to save scum these sections, unlike the combat encounters. Speaking of those combat encounters, they are the heart of the game, and mercifully, that's what you'll spend the vast majority of your time doing. Chains of Freedom's campaign is really just a string of interconnected combat encounter set pieces, which I want to stress is absolutely fine by me. In fact, I think it's probably one of the game's best design choices. This might be more of a personal taste thing, but with tactics games, I'm here for the combat puzzles. I'm not here for your underbaked RPG bloat. Now, how does the combat stack up in this genre with so many heavy hitters? Well, after spending around 40 hours with Chains of Freedom for this review, I can say that it's the definition of a mixed bag. First, the positives. The combat feels good. Although no grid is visually displayed on the environment, the movement pathing feels grid-like, and the classic half and full cover system is implemented nicely in one sense at least, with the various objects littering the dioramas you're going to be fighting in, giving you lots of spots to go and hide behind. Shots feel weighty and satisfying, and the sight lines for the various weapons all feel intuitive. On the enemy's turn, the vast majority of them will take their movement portion of their action economy simultaneously, and that leads to just less wasted time staring at each individual NPC cannon fodder acting. So there's a lot of quality of life decisions in the combat system itself that tell me that the developers definitely have a real love for this genre, and it shows. As for the negatives, there's unfortunately a non-insignificant amount. My main problem with Chains of Freedom is the absolutely atrocious balancing, and I played on the default normal setting. Enemies, after only a handful of hours into the campaign, have an absolutely ungodly amount of health and armor compared to the damage that you're going to do every turn, and also the game just throws way too many of them at you at once. To add insult to injury, they also heal themselves literally constantly, making fights take absolutely forever just due to that and the sheer amount of bad guys. In the back half of the game, there were combat encounters where I was truly expecting a cutscene to kick in at any moment because just the outrageous number of enemies on screen felt like some kind of acknowledgement that you just could never fight off 100 bullet sponges with 4 squad members who are already low on ammo and shoot to bits. But no, the game really wants you to actually engage in these incredibly long, incredibly outnumbered slugfests that can take upwards of an hour per set piece. Now look, I'm all for lengthy battles and lots of content, but there's some seriously glaring problems with the game's systems and balancing that just don't synergize well with these setups specifically. For starters, you're constantly low on ammo for pretty much all of the game, and you simply can't get even a little bit ahead in that regard when you have dozens and dozens of enemies to slay in every single encounter. I mean, even your secondary weapon sidearms, which do laughably little damage, they even require an ammo resource, so there's no freebies. If you run out of bullets, you're forced to use the assortment of melee weapons, which is actually a nice transition to another major problem I have with Chains of Freedom's combat system. Both you and enemies alike miss shots and even miss melee swings way, way too much. You're going to be standing close enough to an enemy militia weirdo to see his pores, and yet somehow you're going to miss 3 times in a row while swinging a socket wrench at his dome.
Dusted.
It just feels terrible from a player experience standpoint, especially when the game takes so much pleasure in just punishing you with all the resources and health issues every single moment in game. Now, to be clear here, I'm not talking about the whole Xcom meme where you're like 95 to land a shot and you miss. No, there is something tuned way, way off with the amount of missing that occurs in this game by both you and the AI, and it's actually kind of a sad blemish on a combat system that actually does have a lot of strengths. There's some other issues as well. The cover system functions well technically, but it just doesn't seem to actually mitigate damage reliably enough. It's kind of weird. Like, the benefit you get from carefully positioning your squad in cover and choosing sight lines, in my opinion, that's one of the joys of this genre. It's just anticlimactically let down by there just not being much of a defensive upgrade from simply standing out in the open like a jerk. All in all, I was kind of fascinated by my experience during my playthrough because my opinion on the combat was just a total roller coaster. There were times that the resource scarcity tension works in spite of itself, and certain battles clicked in just the right way where I got a taste of that kind of Xcom dopamine hit, but without fail, it just wouldn't be long before one of the many balancing problems or confusing design decisions reared its ugly head, leading to frustration and disappointment. Let's talk about progression and systems depth here for a sec. As I mentioned, this game is not trying to have deep, complex skill trees or mechanics, and while I actively like those things when executed well, I actually commend the game designers for knowing what they wanted to do here and offering a streamlined experience that stays within itself. Your team won't level up or get inherently stronger over the course of the campaign at all. Progression is handled purely via these equipable stones that you'll find that can be slotted into each character and which come with your standard buffs for things like action points, HP, evasion percentage, etc. There's some other slightly fancier ones as well, including ones that attempt to spice things up by providing a slightly more powerful boost in exchange for a nerf to one of your other stats, blah blah blah, but this is a very basic system overall. The same can also be said for the weapons, which you'll find new ones during your playthrough, some of which are improvements, but there's an odd amount of lateral upgrades here, and you often won't have enough ammo to try out your shiny new gun anyway. Does the simplicity of the progression or itemization detract from the game experience for me? Not in this case, I don't think. This isn't the thinkiest turn-based tactics game out there, and so it makes sense that the surrounding system architecture keeps things streamlined. I do think at least some kind of leveling system for your characters would have been nice to have, mostly because the game is just so punishing in so many other ways, but this really comes down to one key design decision that shines through at every single moment you're playing, which is that the developers clearly wanted you to feel that survival game style tension at all times. Ammo and resource tension, outnumbered characters tension, health bar tension, just a lot of tension. And frankly, while I admire the distinct point of view on offer here with this survival tactics mashup, it's just not why I like to play turn-based tactics games. There's a reason why they don't play tournament chess with live scorpions in your underwear. In a really well-designed game, the tension comes from the complexity of the battle variables and the overall purity and creativity that you can apply within the systems to overcome the tactical puzzle. In Chains of Freedom, it feels like they just took every shortcut to create difficulty and friction for the player in a not fun way. And that's a shame because there are aspects of what they built that really do work quite well here. By far, Chains of Freedom's strongest attribute is its presentation, which is one of the cleanest and best I've seen in any tactics game ever. It's possible that the studio's history with mobile game design has forced them to consider visual language and user experience in a way that other developers simply don't. Everything from damage numbers to health indicators to tooltips have all been laid out in a way that's clean, it's intuitive, and it's really satisfying. The game's presentation really feels a lot more modern in the way it handles these elements than some of the uglier examples out there in this lovely tactics genre. Also, the game runs very smoothly on Series X, targeting 60 FPS and staying in that neighborhood the vast majority of the time, except for the rare hiccup here and there and only the most geometry-rich set pieces. This is a game that feels smooth and responsive to play, which creates a rather inviting experience for the player. And frankly, it almost definitely got me to stick with Chains of Freedom longer than I would have otherwise. Really high marks here for what the studio achieved in terms of presentation. Replayability with Chains of Freedom is really going to come down to one thing. Do you like the game? If so, there's, I guess, the hardest of the 3 difficulties offered, and that's waiting for you to overcome it, but listen, I'm all for hard difficulty runs in tactics games, but the thought of attempting this myself in Chains of Freedom is actually nauseating. The game is already so punishing in its design choices that I don't think adding additional artificial lashes from the game's well-worn whip sounds like a particularly good time. And as it stands, although the tactical combat is serviceable and occasionally even bordering on pretty good, just didn't like it enough to really think about being a completionist or a masochist moving forward. Beyond that, there's just not a ton else to do here once you've beaten this, so do know that going in. However, there's quite a few fights that you'll encounter through the game because, like I said, it's a string of interconnected combat arenas. So by the time you finish, if you're really loving the combat, you'll probably have some novelty restored, I guess, for the encounters you've forgotten about if you start over. First, the pros. Chains of Freedom is, as I mentioned before, a pretty tightly focused game that did a fairly good job of self-editing into a gameplay loop that philosophically makes a lot of sense to me. The ratio of the 3 core mechanics are justifiable as well. Combat is probably 75% of the loop, exploration 15%, and stealth, thankfully, like 10%. The presentation, as I said, is top-notch, especially if you like a clean, minimalistic aesthetic, although I'm sure detractors will unfavorably compare this style to a mobile game, which I think is mostly an unwarranted criticism. And also, the game runs really well on Series X and load times are super fast. At times, the combat is satisfying, and the resource tension sometimes accidentally, I think, hits the sweet spot, which leads to several battles that are an hour or more that are actually quite engaging. The game is really close to having something quite interesting here, and there are moments where you're going to get that tactics euphoria that's going to remind you of the better games in this genre. But for the cons, they're pretty obvious. This game is woefully unbalanced, with hordes of bullet sponge enemies smothering your pitifully ammo-depleted and wounded team of pea shooters. The cover system and hit percentage system also feel very off to me as someone who has played tons of hours of tactics. And up until now, I haven't even mentioned the story. The story is personally for me the least important element of a game unless it's an RPG that's leaning into it, etc. But Chains of Freedom's story and voice acting are ridiculously bad, in case that's something you care about. They do let you skip everything, which I highly recommend doing for your own mental stability, so I don't know that I necessarily need to hold this against them. I mean, you can skip it, but at times the voice acting was so bad I literally laughed out loud, which was some nice comic relief in between all the punishing. Chains of Freedom is a fascinating game. It knows what it wants to be, and it has some strong ideas, but those ideas just often have subpar or unbalanced execution. On one hand, it respects player time with lots of quality of life features and presentational elements, but it also hates your guts with a burning passion, as evidenced by bizarre design choices that introduce way too much friction too often. If you're a die-hard tactics fan as I am, you know that these games aren't exactly raining from the sky over here on Xbox, so should you buy Chains of Freedom? Well, at $24.99, despite all of the criticism that I've levied in this review, I am comfortable recommending a buy here. But if you're only a casual turn-based tactics enjoyer, I'd recommend staying away until and unless there are balancing patches applied, as I personally needed to rely on my deep experience with these games to be able to cheese my way through some truly unfair and unfun encounters. On a final note, I do hope that the developers look at some balancing patches post-launch, as it would be a shame to be so close to a fairly solid tactics package like this on console and not take the final steps to fine-tune the experience. If they lessen player friction and resource stress just a little bit and tighten up some of the core combat systems like enemy health, cover, hit percentage, this game could really hit its stride. With that, I'm giving Chains of Freedom a score of 74 out of 100 and the Sapphire badge from Xbox Hidden Gems. Tactics fans will find enough here to get their money's worth while hoping for a balancing patch, but casual strategy gamers will likely find the oppressive systems and difficulty too much of a turnoff to overcome. For more in-depth reviews of indie games and hidden gems on Xbox, please make sure to subscribe to the channel as it's brand new and would help me out a ton. If you appreciated a non-AI thoughtful take on this Xbox-focused game review, please also take a quick sec to hit the like button. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.